we had to rush through Book 7. Particularly the last two cantos of Book 7. We haven't said much about either of these cantos, but I'm afraid we may not have the time to do so either today or tomorrow being the last day of our camp, or Adhyayan Satra as we call it. Now, Book 8, as you will see, consists of only one canto, and it's called Canto 3, and the editorial note explains why it is called Canto 3. This is a book about which Sri Aurobindo seems to have said, let us see about it later. Now, I have a very simple-minded explanation which helps us understanding the arrangement of the cantos better. Chronologically, if you really look at it, Cantos 1 and 2 of Book 1 belong here. So far, as we can see, Savitri's yoga, Savitri performs during the last few days of that 1 year which she spends with Satyavan. In fact, the Mahabharata story says the Triratra vow was undertaken 4 days prior to this date announced by Narad. So, that is, by the time Canto 7 of Book 7 is finished, we are ready for that day on which Satyavan was destined to die. And the dawn of that day and the early morning of that day are described in Cantos 1 and 2 of Book 1. And Canto 3 of Book 8 describes the forenoon and the noon. So chronologically, if you regard Cantos 1 and 2 of Book 1 as part of Book 8, just chronologically, it doesn't belong there because Book 8 has a special place, it's called the Book of Death, then probably it will make sense and see why this has to be Canto 3. Now, Canto 3 is Death in the Forest, and Sri Aurobindo follows the original story fairly closely here. That morning, Savitri approaches Satyavan's parents and says, as we see on page 562, 1 year that I have lived with Satyavan here on the emerald edge of the vast woods, in the iron ring of the enormous peaks, under the blue rifts of the forest sky, I have not gone into the silences of this great woodland that enringed my thoughts with mystery, nor in its green miracles wandered, but this small clearing was my world. Says, I have been very curious about this forest, but I have never found the time to wander around and take a look at all the glories and the beauties of this forest. I have been confined more or less to this clearing where our hermitage is located. Now has a strong desire seized all my heart to go with Satyavan, holding his hand into the life that he has loved, and touch herbs as he has trod, and know the forest flowers, and hear at ease the birds and the scurrying life that starts and ceases, rich far rustle of boughs, and all the mystic whispering of the woods. Release me now and let my heart have rest. So would you please permit me to go out this morning with Satyavan into the forest, so that, as she says, I can hear the birds and look at the scurrying life and listen to the rustle of boughs and all the mystic whisperings of the woods. This is the request she makes because she knows that this was the day and she should be by the side of Satyavan. But as you know, neither Satyavan nor Satyavan's parents know about this prediction of Narad's, so they don't know anything about it. And Satyavan's mother says, "Do as thy wise mind desires. O calm child sovereign with the eyes that rule, I hold thee for a strong goddess who has come pitying our barren days. So dost thou serve, even as a slave might, yet art thou beyond all that thou doest. All our minds conceive, like the strong sun that serves earth from above." Somehow, Satyavan's mother recognizes a secret divinity in Savitri. She doesn't spell it out very clearly, but that's what she says. "Although you have been slaving for us since you arrived here," he says, "you are like a strong goddess who has come pitying our barren days, and you have been serving us like a slave." Then she says, if your heart so desires, you are most welcome to accompany Satyavan today into the forest. And that's how she goes, and Satyavan very happily is also very excited that Savitri is accompanying him that morning. They go into the forest, and he has been collecting fruit, chopping wood. On page 564, about 5-6 lines from the top, "But as he worked, his doom upon him came. The violent and hungry hounds of pain travelled through his body, biting as they passed, silently, and all his suffering breath besieged strove to rend life's strong heart cords and be free. Some pain ran through his entire body, and what this pain was, whether it was a sunstroke or a snake bite, there is plenty of speculation about it, and there is a learned article on this topic by Dr. Deshpande, who I don't see today, who normally comes here. He has an article called "Satyavan Must Die." It's a series of articles on this very line, Satyavan must die. Why should you say, why does Sri Aurobindo keep saying Satyavan must die? What is the force of this must and so on? As one of the articles there, he takes this question up and finally comes to the conclusion it must have been a sunstroke. Well, those of you who are medically inclined towards Savitri can make further investigations. I'm just mentioning this as a point of kind of peripheral interest. And he cried to her, when his whole body began to rack with pain, he cried to her, "Savitri, a pang cleaves through my head and breast as if the axe were piercing it and not the living branch. I feel as if the axe I have been using on this tree, on this branch of this tree, it looks as if that somebody is wielding the same axe on my body. Such agony rends me as the tree must feel when it is sundered and must lose its life. A while let me lay my head upon thy lap and guard me with thy hands from evil fate. Perhaps because thou touchest, death may pass." He already is talking about death because the pain must be so acute, so agonizing. So he says, "I'll come down and lie down with my head on your laps. Maybe something, you may have some healing power, something about your touch may drive away even if the god of death is planning to come near us." And so he comes down and is lying down and with his head on Savitri's lap. On page 565, these are his very last words. He cried out in a clinging last despair, "Savitri, Savitri, O Savitri, lean down my soul and kiss me while I die." And even as her pallid lips pressed his failed, losing last sweetness of response. His cheek pressed down her golden arm. She sought his mouth still with her living mouth, as if she could persuade his soul back with her kiss. Then grew aware they were no more alone. Something had come there, conscious, vast and dire. Near her she felt a silent shade immense, chilling the noon with darkness for its back. An awful hush had fallen upon the place. There was no cry of birds, no voice of beasts. A terror and an anguish filled the world, as if annihilation's mystery had taken a sensible form. She suddenly becomes aware of another presence here around them. And when she looks up, she sees a terror and an anguish filled the world, as if annihilation's mystery had taken a sensible form. That was the presence of the god of death. And page 566, last two lines, she knew that visible death was standing there, and Satyavan had passed from her embrace. At that point, she realizes that Satyavan had already passed from her embrace. Now, as you know, this is a book Sri Aurobindo said we'll come back to sometime later what that sentence means, why he said that. People have speculated a great deal about it, but there is no need for us to go into these imponderables at this point. We, however, therefore go on to book 9, which, as you see now, we are in the last part of this epic, book part 3, which consists of 4 books, books 9, 10, 11 and 12. 12 is a very brief book, the epilogue. But in the original Mahabharata story, the ground Sri Aurobindo covers in the epilogue takes about 1/3 of the entire narration. Vyasa, in fact, devotes about 200 lines on what Sri Aurobindo covers in the epilogue. It's for his purposes, the epilogue doesn't have a great deal of importance. As you know, the legend has been used primarily because it can serve as a wonderful symbol, but the epilogue part, which he more or less ignores. Now, books 9, 10 and 11, these 3 books describe what happens between Savitri and the god of death, the dialogue, the conversation, the struggle, whichever way you want to look at it. In the original, as I have been saying, you have something corresponding to this. There, of course, because of Savitri had acquired great power as a result of the various vratas and her fidelity to her husband and so on, she has the power to step into the kingdom of the dead, and she follows this god of death, and the god of death doesn't like it, but Savitri talks to him very pleasingly in a very good diction, good syntax, good grammar. That's what the poet describes. Vyasa talks about this. And she talks to him, she's like a chatterbox. She talks to him various kinds of things about what is dharma, what is righteousness, what is good conduct, and so on. And Yama is really charmed by the vivaciousness, the dignity, the innate culture, the learning, the good manners, the deep insight into matters, sacred and profane as it were, shown by Savitri. And so he is shown as an indulgent god of death. He's not a terror. He's so very indulgent, and he is very free with his gifts, so he gives her various gifts. But finally, Savitri continues and wins him over, and she gets Satyavan back, and they come back to earth. Now, Sri Aurobindo takes this from this idea of this conversation between the god of death and Savitri, and he uses it in a different way, just as I have been trying to explain. Ashwapati's yoga, which was described by Vyasa in 10 lines, Sri Aurobindo describes it in 10,968 lines. And I have explained why he needs such a vast canvas. Savitri's yoga, which in the original is what is the Triratra Bhav of Savitri, once again is converted here into Savitri's yoga, almost about 100 pages long. Here again, the incident is retained, but the god of death is not just some god here in Sri Aurobindo's epic. The god of death represents everything that negates, everything that pulls down the evolutionary urge for the progressive self-manifestation of the divine. That he represents death. Death also is a part of this total scheme. The total scheme which kind of impedes, which provides various kinds of obstacles to this evolutionary urge for the complete self-manifestation of the divine in all its glory. So death here represents all kinds of negativity, all kinds of pessimism, that which would like man to continue as he is, or even probably put this clock of evolution back. That all these forces are represented by the god of death, and that is why the conversation between the god of death and Savitri is entirely at a different level. You see here in one sense a great miracle where intellectual philosophy has been converted into poetic passion of a very rare kind. As you see, as I will show you, the god of death assumes various philosophic positions against Savitri's position, which is primarily Sri Aurobindo's position. Savitri symbolizes that position in a particular way. She wants the fulfillment of her earthly love here on earth. She wants a terrestrial fulfillment of the ideal. Now that's what Sri Aurobindo was talking about. We want the perfection to be realized here on earth. Now this is symbolic. Savitri's assertion, Savitri's aim is symbolic of this. And the god of death takes various kinds of philosophical positions against this. It's like saying, let us write a critique of what Sri Aurobindo is trying to do, let us criticize him. This is what the god of death keeps doing. And all the strongest arguments against Sri Aurobindo's own position can be found in the words used by the god of death. Yama, in fact, is a great critic of Sri Aurobindo's vision, of Sri Aurobindo's ideal. And that's why when the god of death speaks, it's so powerful, his arguments are so powerful. And it's very difficult to believe Sri Aurobindo himself wrote these words. That's the great capacity of a poet. A poet can identify, can empathize with any point of view. That's in one sense. A poet doesn't have this kind of a fixed personality. He has an ability to identify, to get into the skin of almost any character. That's what Shakespeare does, for example. He has a tremendous capacity to get into the skin of a Macbeth or a Hamlet, and you see, this is how characters probably are. And for all times to come, you have characters like Hamlet. Exactly the same way, Sri Aurobindo has this tremendous capacity to identify himself, to get into the skin of an Advaitin. For example, to begin with, you have the nihilist position, which says something like that there is no truth, and the corollary of it, everything is permitted. There is no truth. Don't go after truth, there is no truth. And the sad fact is that most existentialists were anguished that there is no truth. They kept claiming, passionately asserting that there is no truth. But they felt there was some truth, and that's why there was this agonizing. Where is truth? We want truth, but they kept saying there is no truth. This kind of a position the god of death takes and then argues against Savitri, and you will see. Now, when you see this, in Yama's mouth, it's not anymore a philosophical, metaphysical proposition. It's a passionately held conviction. So it comes out as great poetry, it comes out as great passion. And this is what he does. Then he goes on, after this position has been exhausted, he goes on to take up the position of somebody who argues on the basis of realism. All ideals are, after all, kind of wings in the air. Nobody has ever realized any ideal. We must be realistic. Then he takes a third position. Well, don't you know that only spirit is real and matter is unreal? then almost takes a kind of Buddhist position. So he takes various positions, and each one of these positions is held very passionately by the god of death. And so, in one sense, this is a fascinating part. It is not philosophy per se, it's not philosophy of the kind you will see in books, but the force of these philosophies has been poetically expressed, and this is the miracle I was talking about, intellectual statements being converted into great poetic passion. That's what Sri Aurobindo does in these 3-4 books, and that is the charm. And some of the most memorable poetic passages in Savitri also come from this section, as we will see, and they're innumerable. I don't think we'll have time to look at all those. Now, Book 9, the first thing that happens is the god of death has caught Satyavan into a noose, and then he is pulling him into the world of the death. Savitri is, here it's described 574, about 6-7 lines from the top of 574. Something stood there, unearthly, somber, grand, a limitless denial of all being. A limitless denial of all being that wore the terror and wonder of a shape. He says it wore a terror and also wonder. Yama had a shape which made you wonderstruck, but also which terrified you. Something stood there, unearthly, somber, grand, a limitless denial of all being. This is what Sri Aurobindo emphasizes whenever he talks about Yama. He said denial, he stands for this denial of all being that wore the terror and wonder of a shape. In its appalling eyes, the tenebrous form bore the deep pity of destroying gods. A sorrowful irony curved the dreadful lips that speak the word of doom. Eternal night in the dire beauty of an immortal face, pitying arose, receiving all that lives forever into its fathomless heart, refuge of creatures from their anguish and world pain. His shape, what was his shape? His shape was nothingness made real. His shape was nothingness made real. His limbs were monuments of transience, and beneath brows of unwearying calm, large godlike lids, silent beheld the writhing serpent life. The god of death, when he looked at life, life looked like a writhing serpent. All the time, unsure of itself, mesmerized by the eyes of death. Unmoved, their timeless, wide, unchanging gaze had seen the unprofitable cycles pass, survived the passing of unnumbered stars, and sheltered still the same immutable orbs. Savitri has cast, as it were, her heart's protection around Satyavan's being. And therefore, God of death is finding it difficult to extricate Satyavan's being from this hold, Savitri's hold. And so on 575, he says, first line, unclasp, it cried, thy passionate influence and relax, O slave of nature. In the beginning, he treats her with great disdain. Slave of nature, relax your hold, he says, changing tool of changeless law. You're just a changing tool of changeless law. That's the respect he has for human nature, who vainly writhes rebellion to my yoke. What is it? Unclasp what? Thy elemental grasp. Weep and forget. It's all that you human beings can do. Weep and forget. entomb their passion in its living grave, leave now the once loved spirit's abandoned robe. Don't you know? This is the abandoned robe of Satyavan. Why do you want to cling to it? Release it. Pass lonely back to thy vain life on earth. Go back to earth. Savitri is not obliging. Then he goes on, wilt thou forever keep thy passionate hold, thyself a creature doomed like him to pass, denying his soul death's calm and silent rest? I have come here to release him from this agonizing enterprise called life. I have come here to give him rest. Denying his soul death's calm and silent rest, relax thy grasp. This body is earth's and thine. His body belongs to this earth. If at all anything, you have a right over his body. His spirit now belongs to a greater power. Woman, thy husband suffers. In this tug of war, god of death pulling in this one direction, Savitri pulling in another direction, she says, your husband is suffering. Of course, Savitri is also getting ready in the meanwhile. She rose and stood gathered in lonely strength, like one who drops his mantle for a race and waits the signal motionlessly swift. You can't beat the master when it comes his fancy, catches his fancy. He can, in 2 lines, freeze a whole scene. Savitri is now getting ready. How do you describe it? As a sprinter would throw off his whatever mantle that he's wearing to keep them warm. You know, they always wear something limbering up and so on, this mantle. So last 2 minutes, the mantle is down and she rose, stood gathered in lonely strength, like one who drops his mantle for a race and waits the signal. He's waiting for the signal to start. And the phrase is beautiful, motionlessly swift. The race has already begun, but it has not been executed. The motion is already there in his being. He is ready for the race. Motionlessly swift. That's what Savitri is described as. Then, what does Satyavan look now? On page 576, about 5 lines from the top. And like a dream that wakes out of a dream, forsaking the poor mold of that dead clay, another luminous Satyavan rose, starting upright from the recumbent earth, as if someone over viewless borders stepped, emerging on the edge of unseen worlds. Page 577, where the section ends, about 2nd line from the top. Luminous he moved away, the god of death is now leading this procession. Luminous he moved away, behind him death went slowly with his noiseless tread. As seen in dream-built fields, a shadowy herdsman glides behind some wanderer from his voiceless herds. And Savitri moved behind eternal death. Her mortal pace was equalled with the gods. Wordless she travelled in her lover's steps, planting her human feet where his had trod into the perilous silences beyond. Now these threesome are now moving on. First Satyavan's soul, then the god of death, falling god of death, Savitri. Page 580. God of death is quite surprised that Savitri has come thus far. About 15 lines from the bottom. O mortal, turn back to thy transient kind, aspire not to accompany death to his home. As if thy breath could live where time must die, Think not thy mind-born passion strength from heaven to uplift thy spirit from its earthly base, and breaking out from the material cage, to upbuoy thy feet of dream in groundless naught, and bear thee through the pathless infinite. Only in human limits man lives safe. Live within your limits, operate within human limits. You have crossed the bounds which have been laid down for man. You have come into an area which is not yours. First, the god of death gives her what may be called a third degree treatment, as it were. He takes her through a dreadful experience, and hoping that this experience itself might dissuade her, and that is described, Journey in Eternal Night and the Voice of Darkness on Canto 2. We'll read just a little bit. We don't have time for 583, about 7 lines from the top. And what is the terrain like? A mystery of terror's boundlessness, gathering its hungry strength, the huge pitiless void, surrounded slowly with its soundless depths, and monstrous, cavernous, a shapeless throat devoured her into its shadowy, strangling mass, the fierce spiritual agony of a dream. A curtain of impenetrable dread, the darkness hung around her cage of sense, as when the trees have turned to blotted shades, and the last friendly glimmer fades away, around a bullock in the forest tied by hunter closes in no empty night. It's like a bullock feeling all terrified. The bullock is tied to a tree as a bait for the tiger. That's how God of Death wants Savitri now to feel. And so he describes the scene. The thought that strives in the world was here unmade, its effort it renounced to live and know, convinced at last that it had never been. It perished, all its dream and action done. This clotted cipher was its dark result. In this mothering stress of this stupendous knot, mind could not think, breath could not breathe, the soul could not remember or feel itself. It seemed a hollow gulf of sterile emptiness, a zero oblivious of the sum it closed, an abnegation of the Maker's joy, saved by no wide repose, no depth of peace. On all that claims here to be truth and God, and conscious self and revealing word, and the creative rapture of the mind, and love and knowledge, and heart's delight, there fell the immense refusal of the eternal no. Well, you can read that. It's a fairly long passage. Now, 586, the god of death is quite surprised that all these terrors hold no threat for Savitri. Beginning of page 586. This is my silent, dark immensity. This is the home of everlasting night. This is the secrecy of nothingness, entombing the vanity of life's desires. Hast thou beheld thy soul so transient, heart, and known from what the dream thou art was made? In this dark sincerity of nude emptiness, hopest thou still always to last and love? This is the origin of the whole of creation. What thou just now saw, the denial, the darkness, the abyss, from here creation came out. This is all you are made of. Do you still want to establish the kingdom of love? Then same page, about 8-10 lines from the bottom, his sophistry begins. And see how the god of death in 2-3 lines condemns the entire human enterprise. You see, the cry of nihilism, is that human life seems void of any significance. Human enterprise has no meaning. Does it mean anything at all, whether we live or we die? Because life seems to have no meaning, no purpose, no significance. And that kind of thing, the God of Death now captures very brilliantly, very beautifully, about 9 lines from the bottom. And this is, it seems during the 1968 student revolution in Paris, they used to write this slogan in the underground metro. What is it? Something like this. There is no truth, everything is permitted. There is nothing like truth, there is no truth. Everything is permitted. You can do anything that you want. There are no laws, there is no fulfillment, nothing at all. So this is the kind of depths of despair, as if humanity as a whole has no will to live. That kind of an attitude is kind of captured by the God of Death here. He says, just look at these 2 lines. What is man? People have given different descriptions of man. Here, another description. A fragile miracle of thinking clay, armed with illusions, walks the child of time. What is man? A fragile miracle of thinking clay. A fragile miracle. It's a miracle. It's a fragile, all right. One of the weakest animals on this earth is man. Made of clay. But miracle, all right. Look at the brain that he has. The most complicated, the most complex organism. There is nothing more complex than the human brain, and nature seemed to have just fabricated it through a kind of blundering process. A fragile miracle of thinking clay. Nature took a handful of dust and made man and gave him all the thing that he has, a heart that keeps pumping blood minute after minute, minute after minute, minute after minute. 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, it develops some sluggishness, and you are quite surprised which machine works for 70 years without developing any kind of sluggishness. Then the brain, the whole complex mechanism, almost like God. Man is almost like God. It's a miracle. A fragile miracle of thinking clay, armed with illusions, walks the child of time. What is he armed with? Illusions. Illusions like what? Illusions like God, illusions like soul, illusions like patriotism, illusions like love. They're all illusions. There is no God, there is no soul, there is no love, there is no patriotism. Armed with illusions walks the child of time. So helpless walks the child of time. To fill the void around he feels and dreads. To the void he came from, into which he goes, he magnifies his self and names it God. What is your God? You know, little children get terrified when they get up midnight. Well, I guess in India most little children sleep with their mothers or fathers or both together. But in Western countries, a child has to sleep all by itself or himself or herself right from a very young age, and gets up at the midnight, mommy isn't there, feels terrified, dark. And so, to make the child feel reassured, the child is very often persuaded to go to bed with a doll. Doll looks human, And so when the child gets up at midnight, frightened, scared, there's nobody around, looks at the doll and feels reassured. The doll is absolutely useless. The girl at least has life, the doll has no life at all. But psychologically, it's kind of feels comfortable. He says, man is exactly like that. When he wakes up in life and feels totally frightened, he doesn't know which way to turn. Our ancestors have said, take this doll, this is called God. So God is nothing more or nothing less than this doll, which makes you, he's not denying, he's not saying it's totally useless. But if it comes to a crunch, if the child really needs help, I don't think the doll will help the child. Similarly, if mankind really ever needs help, I don't think God has ever been able to provide it. Look at the biting sarcasm. Look at the finesse with which he puts across his viewpoint. We have only done about 5 lines. There are hundreds of lines like this in the whole epic. A fragile miracle of thinking clay, armed with illusions, walks the child of time. To fill the void around he feels and dreads, the void he came from, into which he goes. He magnifies his self and names it God. He calls the heavens to help his suffering hopes. He sees above him with a longing heart, bare spaces more unconscious than himself. You look up there, is there anything more conscious than man? Up there is nothing. They have not even his privilege of mind. You at least have mind. There is nobody up there who has even a mind. And empty of all but their unreal blue. Even the blue of the sky is unreal. The sky has nothing, not even a color, but we all think, oh God, oh Allah, oh Jesus, whatever, you're all up, looking up, we pray. What is this ridiculous thing you are doing? And peoples them with bright and merciful powers. For the sea roars round him and earth quakes beneath his steps, and fire is at his doors, and death prowls baying through the woods of life. When all this happens, you're terrified. God, God, somebody to help us. Who? God. This is what is happening. Moved by the presences with which he yearns, he offers the implacable shrines his soul and clothes all with the beauty of his dreams. The gods who watch the earth with sleepless eyes and guide its giant stumblings to the void have given to man the burden of his mind. In his unwilling heart they have lit their fires and sown in it incurable unrest. Gods have made man accursed by giving him something called the mind. Mind is what has made the human enterprise tragic. You don't find any horse tragic, any animal tragic. Gods, of course, are beyond tragedy. They are the world of perfection. The only creature who is tragic is man. He has lost the innocence of the beasts. He has yet to achieve the perfection. And gods, your imaginary gods, if they are there, if they have given you anything at all, it is they have given you this curse called the human mind.